This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars and free markets meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Today we're talking about two of my favorite things, food and booze. But we're also going to talk about something I find far less appetizing, government regulation. How does government regulation impact how our food and drinks are produced, what goes into them, and where we consume them? How are market forces creating new foods for us, and how might regulations impact the evolution of food in the future? My first guest is Dr. Jason Lusk. Dr. Lusk is a professor and department chair of the Agricultural Economics Department at Purdue University. He's also a Raider alum. Welcome back to Tech, Jason.
Hi, Ben. It's always good to be in Lubbock.
All right. Well, I'm pleased to have you here to talk about this stuff today. And in particular, your new book, Unnaturally Delicious. People have been very pessimistic for a long time about food production and the future of humanity. Whether we're talking hundreds of years ago with Thomas Malthus and his dire predictions that food production wouldn't keep pace with population growth, or more recently, Paul Ehrlich famously in the 1960s said, in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death and there's nothing we can do about it. Yet these dire predictions, we have billions of people in the world today and we're feeding them all. What's the basis for these predictions and why are they always wrong?
Right. Well, I think, the first thing to point out is these were real concerns, and it's the biggest concern throughout most of human history is whether we're going to have enough food to eat. And it's a concern you can see repeated amongst the leading intellectuals 300 years ago, 200 years ago, 100 years ago. And Malthus, his main concern was really economics related. He used this concept we economists call diminishing returns.
Right.
And his thought was basically that there's a fixed amount of land out there, and as we add more people, more workers to that same amount of land, the amount of food available per worker is going to fall over time. And that's a very real economic phenomenon. And it's that logic that has led people year after year after year to predict this really pessimistic outcome. So how did we avoid it? How do we avoid this Malthusian trap? The answer is innovation and growth. We figured out how to get more using less. With each additional worker, we actually got more food. We actually today in the United States produce about twice as much food as we did in the 1940s, and we're using about half the labor. This is exactly the opposite of what Malthus predicted, and the way we can achieve that is because of human ingenuity, innovation, research, and science into food and agriculture.
Because we've actually reduced the agricultural land instead of moving into the marginal, we're keeping just the prime under production even. Yes, it's this ultimate resource, human creativity, as Julian Simon, the economist, would talk about, that's unleashed this.
Yeah, the scarcest resource of all is not land, but the human ingenuity and resource. That's right. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people look at our food system and they look at that 1940s era food and they think, oh, those were the days. Mm-hmm. But really, if we look at it now, we actually can use less land. We can save some of those sensitive environmental areas and still feed over a billion more people than we were, even 25 years ago. So really, it's just a testament to the human ingenuity and creativity and the entrepreneurial mindset that gives people the incentive to think about creating new ways of doing new things because we can make an extra buck doing it sometimes.
So, and I know Lubbock's an agricultural community. You grew up in a farm community. What are some of the most important innovations that have happened that allowed us to avoid these Malthusian predictions and got us to where we are today?
So I'll talk about one that's actually being used on most big farms today, and that's something called precision agriculture. And so farmers today have yield monitors. So as they're going throughout the field, they know exactly how much cotton they're getting per acre, how much corn per acre. And what they can do is use that information and marry it with other data like soil, moisture content, and make really precise predictions about how much fertilizer they should be applying in this part of the land versus that other part of the land. And even which kinds of seed, which kinds of hybrids should we plant here or there. And so, again, there's this idea, I think, often that this, old farmer in his overalls, but today's modern farmer is a businessman or a businesswoman, and they have to be progressive and think about how to use their resources wisely. And this technological innovation that's come about, the sort of big data in agriculture, is allowing farmers to really make more judicious use of things like fertilizer and chemicals and seed, so that they can save on water even, these things that really are scarce, and so that we can continue to feed this growing world population, but do it in a way that we can be responsible about our land use and leave it to our kids and grandkids in good shape.
Right, because by reducing these other things, not only is it profitable for the farmer, but it reduces other environmental impacts.
That's exactly right. So if we can figure out how to make more judicious use of fertilizer, so for example, only putting it in those parts of the field that need it, that's less fertilizer that might, say, run out in the waterways and get into our water supply. And of course, we have good, facilities that help clean our water, but it's more costly whenever we have to deal with things this way. And so, yes, it helps the farmer, but it also helps the environment. It helps us, the food consumer, because most of us don't like to pay more for food. We prefer to pay less. And so this really...
Heard something about a law of demand somewhere.
That's right. Economists don't generally believe in a free lunch. Innovation is the closest thing to a free lunch that most economists will believe in, because it can benefit the farmer, it can benefit the environment, and it can benefit the food consumer.
And thinking about these, so this is actually, the smart farming, and this is relatively recent. Since when we were kids, this wasn't happening. This is, in the last 20 years.
That's right. Some of these technologies have been a long way in the works, and people have been working on them, but they're really just now getting to the point where they're technologically feasible. So when I was a kid, I hoed cotton weeds. I walked from one end to the field to the other, and we maybe just sprayed a blanket amount of fertilizer and the same kind of seed throughout a whole field. And it's really just been in the last 4 to 5 years that these things have really started to get to the point where the data can be merged with decision aids that can be put into a tractor or a fertilizer applicator, that we can make much more precise recommendations. And again, I think the amazing thing about this is that this is stuff that's already being used on the farm, and yet the average food consumer probably has no idea that this is happening.
Until they read your book, probably.
That's right. You should go out and read it.
And competition will drive this too, right? If you're a farmer who's not updating, we're going to expect that they're left behind.
That's exactly right. And so, farmers are in competition with each other, and they're not only in competition with each other, but with producers in other parts of the world. And the way that we've been able to be competitive in United States agriculture is by being more productive. We have more expensive land, we have more expensive labor, we have more regulations. So the way we compete often with people in other parts of the world, other farmers in other parts of the world, is we have to be more productive. And we have to continue to be innovative if we want to be able to continue to be one of the largest suppliers of food to the world.
So let me bring up a kind of critical area here that people complain about our increase in productivity, because it's not just that we get more crops out, but we get more cattle, and we've intensified the way we lay eggs, and hens produce eggs. And some people say that this is inhumane to the animals. How is innovation impacting that, or what do you think about these criticisms of this?
So first, I would say it's a legitimate concern, animal welfare. Most people care about animals, and we don't like the thought that somehow animals are being abused because of the food we're eating. So it's a legitimate concern, but what we have to do is look at the trade-offs that are being presented to us. So, one answer is, let's just go free range. Let the chickens run around. The trouble with that, first of all, it's going to be a lot more expensive. But another problem with that is it may not actually be good for the animal. You let a bird, a hen outside, there are predators, or there are coyotes, there are hawks, there's rain, it gets hot. And so sometimes we move them indoors, and sometimes in these free range facilities, they have higher death rates because there's a thing called a pecking order that is a real life thing. And so there are reasons that producers move those hens indoors and sometimes put them in cages, but that doesn't mean we can't do better. So in the book, I talk about some new kinds of innovative farming systems where maybe it's trying to combine the advantages of some of these open barn systems with cages. They call them enriched cages. That try to compromise between those two, keep birds protected from those bully birds, but also give them some space to exhibit some of the natural behaviors. But one of the ideas that I propose in this book too is something a little more innovative even, and that's creating a market for animal welfare.
So what would a market for animal welfare be?
It sounds crazy.
So I know a market for eggs.
That's right. So you have to kind of stick with me and think creatively here. But the thought here is, let's imagine you're a vegetarian or a vegan. A vegan doesn't eat eggs, but you care about the animal welfare, the well-being of farm animals. Well, what are you going to do?
You can't express it by buying free-range eggs versus other eggs because you're just not eating them.
That's right. So most of the time when we want something, we want to get something, the way we can get that is by willing to pay for it. If I like this jacket and I like a certain style, I'm willing to pay some money for that, and that'll induce a producer to sell that to me. Well, in the case of this vegan, what are they going to do? They're not buying eggs, so it's no wonder that they turn around and want to pass laws or protest, because the only way they can express their concern is through the political process or through the media. So one thought is, can we create a market where they can buy the thing they want? So one of the things an egg producer does, that egg producer produces eggs, but they also produce something else, and that something else is somewhat intangible, but let's call it animal welfare or animal well-being. So as an analogy, for example, a lot of energy companies produce electricity, but they also maybe produce pollution. And there have emerged very effective pollution trading programs in various parts of the country. And these work under a system where there's like a cap and trade sort of thing. And a lot of the viewers here will probably be somewhat familiar with those. And you can imagine something like that in the case of animal welfare, where a producer gets credits. Maybe they have a certifier that comes on their farm, and they get credits for certain production practices that can guarantee a certain level of animal welfare. And then they can sell those credits. And now if you're the vegetarian or vegan, you can say, oh, I'm going to buy those credits. And how does that provide an incentive? Well, the producer knows, well, if I can get paid a premium for selling these credits over here, maybe I'll adopt different production practices that actually improve the well-being of hens. And you also have a lot of big buyers of eggs out there, like a McDonald's or a Walmart, that might be really interested in promoting their brand image by buying some of these credits as well.
So he gets two revenue sources, one from consumers of his eggs, the other from people who are happy that he's treating his hens a certain way.
That's exactly right. And so unlike the case of maybe some of the pollution trading that I mentioned before, which is sort of regulated by the government, in this case, the producer would have all the incentive to adopt. They wouldn't be required to, but if they thought they could make an extra buck doing it, why not give it a try?
Could be a perfect new type of market process in order to sort this out a little bit better, maybe. That's an innovative solution.
Yeah, so we economists don't create sometimes new precision agriculture or new seed varieties, but one thing we can help do is create markets and help assign property rights to new things and help people get what they want through a market process.
And that only happens by talking about these ideas, and thank you for doing it on a show like this here with me today.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. It's been great to be on.
All right, thank you. Up next, Lubbock was once a dry county. Stick around to find out some of the economic consequences of dry county laws and other alcohol regulations.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Stephan Gohmann. Dr. Gohmann is the BB&T Professor of Free Enterprise and the Director of the John Schnattner Center of Free Enterprise at the University of Louisville. He's also an expert on the regulation of alcohol and is here to discuss the consequences of dry county laws and other alcohol prohibitions. Steve, welcome to Texas Tech and to the show.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
So maybe it would be best if we start at the beginning. Dial back close to 100 years now to alcohol prohibition, and one of the things that I think is one of the most idiotic laws that the U.S. government has ever passed. What are the predictable economic consequences with full-on prohibitions on the sale and distribution of alcohol?
Well, when you make something illegal, you make it good for entrepreneurs who want to break the law. So certain people were selling alcohol illegally, but when you sell alcohol illegally, you want to make a lot of money, and oftentimes the alcohol content went up. So beer wasn't being sold; it was alcohol, or it was liquor. And the quality went down. And this is true not only with alcohol, it's true with drugs. The quality of drugs are much worse, but a higher potency nowadays than they would be if we didn't have illegal drugs. So the prohibition started that, and then you get gangs. So I've got my territory, I want to sell my alcohol. Well, somebody else wants to sell alcohol there too, because it's very lucrative business.
Let's go back to that first point for just a second here. But so the demand for the product doesn't go away. People are going to supply it. But why is it that we can expect potency is going to go up and quality is going to go down?
Well, so if I can sell a higher potency one, I don't have to sell as much quantity. And you're trying to sell quantity, and you're doing this illegally. You want to get it to the people pretty quickly and not get caught. So you don't need as much quantity. And quality, why do you care? It's illegal. What is somebody going to do, sue you?
Right. So there's no lawsuit mechanism to go back to ensure quality, or for that matter, even name brand. And potency, because you got to smuggle this stuff, right? So it's like when you sneak into a concert, someone doesn't stick a beer in their pocket, it's liquor that's sticking in their pocket.
Exactly.
Right?
In fact, when we talk a little bit later maybe about this, kids always take alcohol into football games instead of beer because it's a lot more potency.
Same idea going on here. Yeah. All right, and then why is it that gangs necessarily or organized crime is what ends up supplying it?
Well, it's illegal, so you don't have the contractual system and businesses where they have to abide by the law. So you have people that are breaking the law. If I'm breaking the law, I don't care if I kill somebody else. If I want to make money and take your territory, that's the way I'm going to take it, because there's no other way to do the competition. Some competition comes in, and I don't like competition. I either shoot them and kill them, or I have to lower my price. But I don't want to lower my price, so the alternative is gang warfare.
So just like in markets, there's still competition, but the perverse incentives created by illegality turns that competition to violence.
Absolutely.
So the United States finally came to its senses, passed the 19th Amendment, alcohol became legal. But yet we still have tons of alcohol regulation today, and even miniature versions of prohibition. Here in Lubbock, until 2009, we were a dry county, which meant we could have restaurant and bar sales of alcohol, but no retail sales. So what are some of the consequences of dry county prohibitions?
So a lot of economists have looked at dry counties, and one of the consequences is if I'm in a dry county and I want alcohol, I've got to drive somewhere else to get it. And if I go there and go to a bar and start drinking, my chances of having a DUI, my chances of killing somebody in an alcohol-related accident is much higher because I'm driving a lot further. And a lot of studies have found that of course, DUI rates are higher in wet counties, but then when you look at the counties where the people come from, they're really higher for people from dry counties. So people from dry counties are going into wet counties and then getting drunk and getting DUIs.
Aha. Yeah, and you could actually see the distance in driving just around here in Lubbock is from when we were a dry county. As soon as you get outside of the city line, you see all these abandoned buildings that used to sell alcohol.
Absolutely. It was a great business deal for businesses outside of the dry counties and the wet counties to just set up shop right next to the county line. And they would probably push for these dry county laws because it makes the customers go to them instead of buying in the county.
And what other effects does it have in people's consumption in the dry counties then?
Well, we looked at some data in Kentucky. If you're in a dry county and you're getting alcohol illegally, you're already breaking the law. Probably have stills and you're making alcohol. Again, you're going to make higher alcohol content drinks instead of beer. But we also found that there's more meth labs. So in dry counties in Kentucky, there's 2 times as many meth labs as there is in wet counties. And if the state of Kentucky went totally wet, we'd have a 34% reduction in the number of meth labs. And the reason we have these meth labs is because, I think, is you're already breaking the law. So you got this punishment gradient. If you already know how to break the law, you know how to hide your still, you can hide your meth labs too. And so I think that's driving it.
Yeah, is there a substitution between products then too, or is it mostly just the supply part, you think?
It's probably just the supply part, but I'm thinking if I go to a liquor store in Louisville where it's a wet county and say, hey, I want to buy some meth, the guy behind the counter is going to look at me like I'm an idiot. But if I'm buying alcohol in a dry county from somebody who's selling it illegal, I say, hey, I want to buy some meth, he might know where it is. Yeah, I've got some in the back room or something. So I think it's a supply issue, but I think it's because you're already breaking the law. You go ahead and keep breaking it.
Now, what about other drug use then? Is there a substitute between alcohol and other harder drugs when alcohol is harder to get?
Yeah, so there's been some studies looking at that issue also, and what people found is that when you have dry counties, there's more people substituting other drugs, and so the drug use is actually lower in wet counties than in dry counties.
So these dry county laws then, why do counties pass them? Is it purely that we think alcohol's bad and we don't want people doing it?
Well, you've got certain groups of people that are very anti-alcohol, and most of the dry counties tend to be in southern states, and southern states tend to have a lot of Southern Baptists. So there's a group that has this morality issue about alcohol, and they don't want to drink, and they don't want you to drink, and that's the only religion I know of that they don't want other people to drink. So they push for these laws.
But in addition to that, so that's, I think, true, but we get these really weird, so like Lubbock before, we were a dry county for retail sales. but you could still have all the booze you wanted if you went to the restaurant or the bar. What type of Baptist says, you know what, you can drink in the restaurant or bar, but don't get any to bring home with you?
Well, now that's the second group. So there's a group with a moral interest, the Baptists, but there's a group with an economic interest. If I can make money by having a law that makes it harder for competitors to compete with me, I'm going to push for this law. So if what was the law again here?
It was a retail sales dry, but you could be wet in restaurants or bars.
Yes. So if I'm a restaurant, I want these laws, because if you can't buy alcohol at a retail store and you want to go out and have a drink today and you don't have any alcohol at home, you're going to come out to my bar and you're going to drink. So you get these strange bedfellows. You get the what they call bootleggers, because they were bootleggers in the past, but these are legal guys here now. But they want to have the economic interest, and they have to get the voters to come along. And generally, if you get people who have a moral interest, you can get these laws passed. And so my guess is, even when they try to make it a totally wet county here, people argue, well, there'll be a lot more people drinking alcohol. And they try to make the moral argument, even though it's the economic interest that wants the law in place.
And you think this is a general phenomenon of not just the weird one that we had in Lubbock? Because throughout Texas, you have tons of different dry county regulations of different ways that each one's done. This is a general phenomenon, you think, of mixing morality and pure interest group seeking politics.
Yeah, it's all rent seeking, and initially maybe the original prohibition was probably this morality issue. But nowadays, any of these prohibitions is probably much more an economic interest, but they make the moral argument, because the moral argument works a lot better than, oh yeah, I'll make a lot of money if you make this law. So they always try to get the moral argument to get people to go along with it.
Well, here's another weird one for you that I get. So, direct shipments of wine. So the Supreme Court passed a law a while ago that said you have to be non-discriminatory. The state can prohibit shipments of wine, or it can allow shipments of wine, but it can't discriminate against in-state versus out-of-state wineries. So I can get wine shipped direct to my house here in Texas from wineries, but I can't do it from a retail store. What's going on with that?
Well, so you got different interest groups again, right? So it might be that the retail stores, they don't want to compete with retail stores out of state, so they don't want you getting those shipments. Might be wineries here in the state want to be able to ship out of state, so they want to make sure if they can ship out of state, you got to have a reciprocal law to ship in state. So it's economic interest working on both sides to keep those laws in place. We saw this in a beer study I did. We looked at the number of breweries in each state per capita. And what we found is if I looked at census regions, the South consistently had fewer breweries per capita. And the reason was they had these really bad laws, high taxes, you couldn't self-distribute. If you can self-distribute beer, states that have self-distribution laws have 50% more breweries. So this allows the brewery just to sell the beer to the local restaurants and stuff. Well, the South doesn't have very many of those laws. They're starting to get them now, but they didn't. And it was a bootlegger and Baptist argument. In this case, lots of Baptists, and they would vote in politicians who would keep these laws in place. But the bootleggers in this case were the big macro breweries. And what we found was their campaign contributions in those states as a percentage of total campaign contributions were much higher, and the higher they were, the fewer breweries you found in those states.
So actually, maybe you could generalize for us here then. What is our alcohol distribution system in the United States, and why is it shaped the way it is?
All right, so most states got to choose how to do the distribution system, and most states decided to do a three-tier system. So the distiller or the brewer makes the alcohol, they sell it to a distributor, who then sells it to a retail outlet or a bar, who then sells it to us. And so that's called the three-tier system. Well, during Prohibition, when they thought it was going to end, and it ended not because we decided we wanted people to drink alcohol, we decided we needed tax revenue because we were in the Great Depression, so they ended it for economic reasons. But during Prohibition, Augustus Bush wrote to Roosevelt saying, we got to get rid of these saloons. So Budweiser was trying to sell their beer throughout the United States, but most cities had saloons that had just a local brewery, and the brewery owned the saloons. So all the saloons were owned locally, and so Budweiser didn't have any place to sell their beer except for maybe restaurants and hotels. So he pushed for a law that said, oh, only have bottled beer and only sell it in hotel and restaurants. And then they decided, well, why don't we just have distributors? Because then I can't own a saloon if I'm a brewery. I have to sell it to a distributor who then sells it to a saloon, and it puts the brewer in a much worse situation.
And this is the barrier the new breweries are bouncing up against trying to open in the United States today.
Absolutely. In some states you can self-distribute, in other ones you can't.
All right, well, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you, I've enjoyed it.
One of the main lessons of economics is that incentives motivate human behavior. In the first half of the show, we learned how the profit incentive in agricultural markets has expanded productivity in ways beyond our wildest imagination from a generation or two ago, and keeps us much better fed today, all while using less land and being better for the environment. Unfortunately, incentives can pervert behavior in bad ways too. In the second half of the show, we saw how government regulations on alcohol production and consumption often make people try to satisfy their desires in ways that end up making themselves or others worse off. By driving farther to get alcohol when they live in a dry county and causing more drunk driving accidents, or by consuming other products like narcotics that might be more dangerous for them when they don't have access to alcohol. Either way, incentives are driving human behavior. That's the main lesson I got from today's show. See you next time.